Yes, here we go after midnight again. Okay, Joseph, tell us about the conference.
Are we recording?
Yes.
Oh, gee. Thanks. Well, this conference that I wanted to talk about, it's coming up the last weekend of June. It's called the Secret Space Program Conference. And it'll be in San Mateo, California, which is kind of in the Bay Area. And there's, I'll be honest, the reason I kind of wanted to talk about it is it's my hope. I haven't spoken at a conference in about 5 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But that's not because you have not been asked to. I happen to know that people have asked you many times.
Yeah, they have. I've been reluctant to do so because we really need a new conference culture in the alternative community. We really do. Because in the past you get invited to these things, and in most cases, in my case anyway, I felt constantly on the defensive.
Yeah.
Because you had people with their stories and their philosophical commitments, and you know, I was odd man out because I'm not so ready to jump on the ET bandwagon all the time.
Yeah.
And you know, people that know me know I'm not opposed to it. It's just I don't rush to explain everything in that fashion.
Right.
And if you look at the speakers lineup at this thing, it's a very interesting lineup. Dr. Carol Rosen, who knew Werner von Braun, she's the one that actually told the story of him telling her that the order of enemies would be communism, then then terrorists, then nations of concern, then asteroids, then extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
You know, that's coming from von Braun via her when she knew him at Fairchild Industries. So I'm kind of excited to meet her because her take on all of this is very different than most of the other people at this conference. So, you know, there's not an agenda here. That's one thing I like about it. There's some other guests, Michael Schratt, that you've had on. He's done a lot, and I mean a lot, of research on aerospace technologies and the financial drain in the public black budget. And let me explain what I mean about that. The public black budget is the black budget that everybody thinks of when you say black budget. That's the one that gets hidden in other budget items in the budget, okay?
Okay.
That's not what I mean when I say hidden system of finance. I mean something so totally black that it has no congressional oversight and very little executive oversight. It's something so hidden. It's almost totally in the hands of the intelligence community. So that's something different. And then, of course, Secretary Fitz will be there, and she approaches this whole system of black budget finance from a very different angle than I do.
Yeah.
And I don't think when I say that, I don't mean a mutually exclusive angle. I just simply mean that it's another perspective on the same thing.
Yes.
Richard Dolan will be there, of course, and basically it's his idea of, you know, breakaway civilization that we're discussing, because he's the one that came up with the idea. So he'll be there. Mark McCandlish, who's another interesting figure, because it was Mark McCandlish. He's actually an artist and has done art for the military, you know, cutaway diagrams and things of this nature. Yeah. Well, if you don't know Mark McCandlish's story, he's the one that first disclosed the existence of this so-called alien reconstruction vehicle, or sometimes it's called the flux liner if you look at it. But apparently it's a human technology, but it's very advanced, that a friend of his saw at Edwards Air Force Base, and he's been researching that ever since he first heard the story. So that's going to be there.
Whoa.
Yeah, he would be a good one to have on your show because his story is very, very important.
Well, we'll see if we can line him up.
Yeah, I actually mentioned his story in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, and I kind of review what Richard Dolan said in his books about it, but he's definitely worth hearing in person.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's put together a lot of information. He's tried to kind of back-engineer the science of this thing, and he's talked to physicists like Hal Puthoff and some other people to try and get a handle on what concepts may have been involved with this. And
do you know Hal Puthoff? Years ago, I had a red female Doberman that went missing, and he tried to locate her.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Huh.
Bless his heart.
Well, he's a nice man.
Yes, yes, he is.
He's not too far from you. He's in Texas at the University of Texas at Austin's Advanced Studies Institute. But Mark McCandlish will be there. John Rappaport will be there. So it's a good lineup of people, and it's if you look at the speakers list, it's not the same old group of people, telling their stories. This is one thing that I'm hoping will come out of the conference, is that we'll set a new standard for conference culture in the country. And I'm not objecting to people with stories to tell, or whistleblowers, or insiders, or any of that. But there's so much of that already in the conference culture that we need a real venue where people can get together and talk with each other.
Yes.
And do so in an elevated way. So that's what I'm hoping will come out of this. And then, of course, yours truly is speaking a couple of times as well. So
yeah.
I'm hoping that we'll set a new standard here, because there is, all of the evidence, particularly the financial evidence, and this is something I know that Secretary Fitz will be talking about. I'll be talking about it as well. The financial evidence is that there is something huge going on, and you cannot explain it all simply by saying all these trillions of dollars are going merely for covert operations. Covert operations don't cost trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
Especially over several decades.
Yes, that's true.
So, there is something going on, and whatever it is, by the nature of the case, requires a lot of money. And, advanced technologies would certainly fit the bill. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be an interesting conference. And for me, it's going to be interesting because I haven't met many of these people. I've only met Secretary Fitz in person.
Wow.
I haven't met Richard Dolan. I haven't met Mark McCandlish, or I've met Michael Schratt a couple times. But for me, it's going to be, and I think that's the other big point here, is that people can actually meet these people, interact with them, and talk. We're planning to have some roundtable discussions, panel discussions where people can ask everybody questions and some freewheeling discussion, which I think is needed.
Yes, it is needed, Joseph.
Yeah, there's something, as well as I do, there's something about direct human contact.
Yes.
There's something about, like these interviews that you and I do here on your show, there's something about that that's very different than just sending emails or texts or blogs and all of that stuff back and forth.
Right. Well, today I did an audio with Drone, and
Jaron van Straten?
Yes, and he said that you have 2 slots where you're going to be talking.
Right. I don't know why they did that. I don't mind, but I don't know why they did that. I guess I'll be speaking on Saturday at the conference and then again on Sunday. So I have kind of what I'm trying to do is review the case I've been laying out in these books, because I grant people the idea that what I've been doing is very complex, so I'm going to be trying to just summarize my chain of reasoning in those books. But I'm in the second part of my presentation. I'll be adding some new information that came my way, preparing for these conferences, because there's been some huge indicators out there lately that the powers that be have been thinking precisely in the terms that I argued in the Covert Wars books that they'd be thinking in. NASA just recently has released a lot of e-books about ancient astronauts and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And petroglyphs and everything else, Well, part of my reasoning in the Covert Wars books was that by the nature of the case of the UFO, they would look at things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They may not tell people publicly, but they would look at things like that.
Yeah.
Well, recently they've announced that this is precisely what they've been doing. I suspect they've been doing it for a long time, but they've basically kind of confirmed that, this hidden policy-making culture has been going on. That's really what I've been trying to do in the books. That's really what I'm trying to do in these talks, is kind of reverse engineer the policy-making culture of this group. How would they think about all this stuff? How would they respond to it?
Yes.
How would they project a long-term plan of response? All of this stuff. And crucial to that, in my opinion, is that they would have inevitably looked at some, not necessarily all, but they would have looked at some UFO activity as provocative at the minimum.
Yes.
And hostile at the maximum. Oh. And they would have concluded that we're dealing here with a potential threat, albeit possibly not an imminent one.
Oh.
So, and I'm hoping, Georgianne, to present another picture, another argument to the one that you always hear in the ufology community, that, well, ET is so advanced.
Yeah.
That we can, there's no way we could ever possibly challenge them, and they're so advanced, and they could easily extinguish us if they wanted to, and therefore they're not hostile. So I'm going to be trying to present a case that may not necessarily be the case. They
right.
may not be hundreds or thousands of years ahead of us technologically. And even if that were the case, that doesn't make them morally superior.
Right. They certainly weren't morally superior the last time they were here.
No, precisely. And this is what the ancient, if they were examining the ancient records as they've now disclosed that they have been,
mm-hmm.
that would be obviously the conclusion that they'd have to come to.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating.
There's a lot going on, and I'm hoping that we'll stir up a critical mass of discussion. I really do.
Oh, well, I do too, because it's badly needed.
Yeah, it really is. You stop and think about it, Georgianne. It really is. There's just a few people
mm-hmm.
in this whole field that are researchers.
Yes.
And, again, I'm not trying to belittle people with their abduction stories at all. That has a place in all of this. But they get so much time at events like this that researchers kind of get crowded out.
Yes.
There's few researchers in the field, and by and large, most of them, in some form or fashion, are on the ET bandwagon. And
oh yeah.
I'm certainly not opposed to that. I'm just trying to bring a different perspective to it.
Well, it needs a new, fresh perspective, and if anyone can do that, it's you, Joseph.
Well, not just me. There's everyone's bringing something to the table. Richard Dolan is. I mean, this is something people really have to understand, is that when he came out with his idea of the breakaway civilization, it wasn't just something he was tossing out there. He pointed out that this was something that emerged in the Cold War context.
Yes.
And therefore that the implication here is that the policy formation culture of this group is going to be colored by the Cold War perspective. he pointed out that advanced technologies would give this group the ability to start pulling away from the rest of humanity. We've certainly seen indicators of that. In other words, he thought this out very well. He laid the scaffolding,
Yes.
for people like me and Catherine Fitz and everybody else to to kind of think about. So.
And I hear, what's the fellow's name? Red Star?
Morningstar.
Morningstar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's got information on the moon, and can you tell us a little about that?
Well, I don't know what that information is. This is one thing that's interesting about this conference. The speakers are not, and I think in a certain sense, perhaps deliberately so, we're not communicating with each other directly on, trying to coordinate what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
Which I think is good, because I think whatever consensus emerges has to emerge in discussion rather than pre-planning.
Well, it's pure that way.
Yeah, it is. It is. That's my hope anyway for what will emerge from this. And the other thing here is with the panel discussions and so on and so forth. People send me information all the time, as they do you.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that kind of culture will be created here too. That this isn't just a speakers conference. This is the participants conference. That they'll feel free to share information, perspectives, thoughts, and so on. Because this is too big of a problem for any one individual to try and sit down and figure out.
Oh yeah. Gee.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
So I'm really hopeful that we'll make a difference here. I really am.
Well, you've got a new book that you're working on.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I'm really not working on a book right now. I'm in research mode, and I may be in research mode for the rest of the year. I'm reading a lot of stuff for the next round of books.
Did you hear that, everybody? Work out his PayPal button, because he's got to get research material.
Well, I've got a lot of it. I've been gathering a lot of materials over the years for these next few books.
Oh my gosh, Joseph.
There's a lot of things yet I still want to do. But in other words, what I'm saying is don't expect 2 books this year to come out.
Yeah.
The likelihood is that it will be just the one that I finished in April, and I think that's the one you're probably talking about. That one, that book is called Thrice, Great Hermetica and the Janus Age.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's... I'll be very honest, it's a messy book when you read it. But by the end, I think you'll see how the dots connect. I'm hoping, anyway.
Oh, boy.
Keeping my fingers crossed.
Joseph, do you think that this so-called New World religion that they're going to come out with is based on Hermeticism?
I think there's a good chance will be based on twisted Hermeticism.
Hermeticism, yeah.
Yeah. The biggest thing, and that's largely what this book is about. It's about Hermeticism and its influence during the Middle Ages, particularly kind of as a subterranean or underground counterculture influence.
Yeah.
It's how to put it. Back when I was teaching college, I taught medieval history. Almost every semester I would teach medieval history. And I had a relatively decent textbook that I was required to teach from. And in the course of teaching, almost every semester, this would happen almost without fail. There would be a student or two that would raise their hand and say, well, Dr. Farrell, it says here this and it says here that. Is there a connection? And if so, what are the implications?
Yeah.
And I would have to respond something to the effect, yes, there is a connection, and they're not talking about it because, in effect, what it leads you to is to try and concoct a kind of conspiracy theory view of the Middle Ages and, of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
So in other words, in a certain sense, and I kind of hint at this in the preface to the book, in a certain sense, this is the book I wanted to write back then.
Oh, my goodness.
But didn't dare because, I was still at that time hoping I'd get a permanent position and so on and so forth. So I didn't dare, say that I suspected the Templars were involved with the Fourth Crusade. I didn't dare say that I suspected that the Fourth Crusade was deliberately intended from the outset to sack Constantinople. It wasn't a change of plan in mid-course. There's all these things. So I kind of build up a circumstantial case in the book for why I think the Templars were involved in the Fourth Crusade. There's certainly indications that Templars were present in Constantinople almost immediately upon its conclusion. So, reasoning backwards, they were there. I certainly think, as I laid out in Financial Vipers of Venice, I certainly think Venice kind of intended from the outset to end up in Constantinople and had no intention whatsoever of going to the Middle East with that crusade. I make a case that you have to view that crusade, the Albigensian crusade, and the subsequent demise of the Templars as all one big thing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this is not done in standard medieval history textbooks. The other thing I try and do in the book is there's a lot of bloodline hypothesis out there. You've got Dan Brown, you've got years ago Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Messianic Legacy. All these things were arguing that, well, Christ had a secret marriage or affair with Mary Magdalene, sired children with her. You have that whole thing that's been out there now for a couple of decades. There are other versions of that bloodline idea. So really what I'm trying to do in the book is also show that there is clear evidence of some sort of coordination on the part of a very few select families in some of these events during the Middle Ages. And these connections continue on into the Renaissance and past into the early Enlightenment and the beginning of the 30 Years' War. You can find these connections at work that late.
Wow.
So, in other words, I'm trying to corroborate in a loose fashion the idea, well, you can't dismiss this idea of bloodlines. There's clearly something going on here. If you just open your eyes and admit the very obvious facts.
Well, Joseph, they couldn't have called Jesus Rabbi unless he was married.
Well, that's a huge problem right there, yes.
Yeah.
That's a huge problem right there. I'm trying also in this book to set up a possible book dealing solely with kind of revisionist theories of biblical origins and so on and so forth.
Oh, that is so much needed, Joseph.
Yeah, I know it is.
Oh, my goodness.
But it has to... But
we will kiss your ring.
No, you won't. I don't want all that slobber on my hands.
You're not a DNA swapper either, huh?
No, no.
Okay.
The reason I did it with the Middle Ages and Renaissance first is because that provides. You'll see in the end of the book how it provides the context to do that sort of examination, because the other thing that I do in the book is I attempt to point out that there is, due to some recent research, there is a very good possibility that what the Templars found had less to do with recovering the Jewish temple treasure and quite a lot to do with something dealing directly with Egypt.
Aha.
Aha.
Oh, my goodness.
That's That's at the very end of the book.
That's huge.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yes.
In the middle part of the book, I try and show the influence of Hermeticism on Shakespeare, a.k.a. The Earl of Oxford, who I definitely think was Shakespeare. I do a kind of a brief review of The Merchant of Venice by reviewing some little-known literary criticism of that play. Because if you read that play in particular, I mean, most of Shakespeare's late plays are just stuffed. I mean, it just completely, totally stuffed with Hermetic references of one sort or another.
Yes.
It's impossible. Once you know what the symbols are to look for, it's very clear that this was an individual that was extremely well versed in Hermetic doctrines and literature, and that this couldn't possibly have been the product of an illiterate that could barely scrawl his name from Stratford-on-Avon.
Yeah.
You know,
they try to hide things in the most ridiculous ways. Oh my gosh.
Well, you know, there's been a lot of scholarship on the Earl of Oxford hypothesis. Even Orson Welles, when he was alive back in the 50s, suggested that, you know, it's the Earl of Oxford, not the guy from Stratford-on-Avon. Mark Anderson wrote a wonderful book called Shakespeare by Another Name.
Yeah.
Big, thick book about Shakespeare authorship. But anyway, I get into that. I get into a Hermetic analysis of some of the music of the two great Bachs, which is a lot of music theory to throw on people, but I hope they'll get what I'm trying to get at here when they read that part of the book. And there's also a chapter on Hermetic politics that is just, I think when people will see it, the Hermetic politics connects directly with René Descartes.
Oh boy.
You know, and people will immediately, that have been following what I've been doing with all of this, they'll recall that René Descartes said some very interesting things about ancient mathematical analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
You know, Shakespeare, Manly P. Hall, in his
Secret Teachings of All Ages?
Yes, has a picture of Shakespeare and an overlay of Francis Bacon.
Yes.
And the resemblance is, wow.
The resemblance of all those guys, John Dee, Francis Bacon, Earl of Oxford, William Shakespeare, all these guys, the resemblance is interesting. The reason I tend, and I'll be very honest, since you mentioned Francis Bacon, way back in junior high school, my two favorite things in our little junior high school library, Patrick Henry Junior High in Sioux Falls, my two favorite books, I read these constantly. The librarians got tired of seeing me check out these books. Why don't you read something else? I used to read Albert Einstein and Leopold Enfeld's little book called The Evolution of Physics. It's a wonderful little book. And then there was a book in the library about the Baconian hypothesis of Shakespeare authorship, complete with an examination of all the codes that were supposedly in his plays that indicated he was the author. So, you know, very early on I started entertaining the idea, well, this Shakespeare business, it's nonsense. There's somebody else behind this that had a much broader, deeper education. For my part, I do think that the Earl of Oxford is probably the best contender, particularly when you see what I say about the Merchants of Venice.
Okay. Oh, boy.
Because the Earl of Oxford spent time in Venice. He made it his headquarters as he was touring the northern Italian city-states. And the way he got to Venice was he was loaned, I think, 3,000 ducats by a Venetian Jew. So, this shows up in the play with Shylock. It shows up with the loan to Antonio, that sets up the plot of the play.
Yeah.
But there's something in The Merchant of Venice that is huge, and I'm not even going to say what it is. I'll let people read what I put out there. I was put onto this by Dame Frances Yates, that wonderful British scholar of Hermeticism in the Renaissance, that her work is so important. It's just huge. But she found this other fellow and kind of dismissed him, I think, rather too abruptly. But she was operating with the Stratford-on-Avon hypothesis of authorship. But when you change it to the Earl of Oxford, it makes perfect sense.
Oh, boy.
because the Earl of Oxford did write codes in his letters and so on, and was perfectly capable of doing so. So that whole scene there with him and William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and all of the Hermetic influences at work around Elizabeth's court, Spencer, the fairy queen. Well, where's all this coming from? And you read Spencer, and it's shot through with Hermetic imagery that's been grafted onto Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And all of that kind of continues on into the court of James I. So it's a huge story, Georgianne, and it's I'm not anywhere close to done. And squatting right in the center of the story, like it or not, are the Templars.
Oh boy. How intriguing.
Well, let's look at the Templars for a minute, if you don't mind.
Can you hold on just a minute? I've got to let Moshe out.
Okay, what do you want me to hold on to?
Well, your thought.
Okay.
Okay, hold on, everybody. Okay, everybody, here we go.
The Templars, if we can look at them for a minute, one of the strange things that, is squatting. It's one of those obvious facts, Georgianne, that is just squatting there in the Middle Ages that doesn't get talked about.
Yeah.
And that's the Albigensian Crusade.
Yeah.
The internal European crusade that was launched against the Cathars in Languedoc in southern France. The interesting thing is the Templars don't show up for that crusade. They don't participate at all.
Gee.
They politely excuse themselves from it.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting because the crusade was ordered by Innocent III, Lothario de Conte.
He wasn't so innocent.
Well, no, he certainly wasn't so innocent. But the question is if you have an international military crusading order like the Templars that were chartered to be directly under papal jurisdiction, why is it then that when the Pope calls for a crusade, the Templars, in what amounts to nothing but disobedience, don't participate?
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing is if you look at the history of the Templars, the very early period of the order, you had that very tight, close connection with Bernard of Clairvaux.
Yeah.
The big Cistercian guru, if you will.
Yeah.
And by the time of the Albigensian Crusade, it's Arnaud de Citeaux, the Grand Prior of the Cistercians, who's leading the crusade against the Albigensians. So in other words, there's something else going on here that doesn't get asked. Why the break between the Templars and the Cistercians? Why are the Cistercians leading this crusade, which was just a bloody genocidal affair that lasted a couple of decades at least? And why are the Templars, and for that matter, their rivals, the Hospitallers, not even showing up for the crusade?
Right.
The question that should be asked that doesn't get asked in academic textbooks is, well, why is this the case? You can't answer the reason why. You cannot answer that question without indulging in some, if I can put it this way, conspiracy theory speculations. There's just no way to do it.
Right.
And then after the standard academic explanation, Georgianne, is, well, that most of the Templar holdings in Europe at the time were concentrated in precisely the Languedoc.
Yes.
Okay?
And that is alleged to be where what remained of Jesus' family went to.
Well, yeah, that's all those bloodline hypotheses out there.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the Cathars, the Albigensians, did have a set of beliefs that were diametrically in contradiction to Latin Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
But with the Templar holdings in the Languedoc being what they were, this would have put the Templar order in direct contact with the Cathar nobility there
Yes.
in the Languedoc, almost on a daily basis.
Yep.
So, the standard academic reason is, well, the Templars wouldn't have participated because it's their holdings that are the problem. Well, if the Templars had participated, their holdings would have been exempted from crusading activity. So, in other words, that explanation doesn't really wash.
Yeah.
So you have to seek the real reason for their non-participation elsewhere. And so, what is it? In my book, I attempt to show people that when you're looking at the Fourth Crusade, when you're looking at the Albigensian Crusade, and then the subsequent demise of the Templars, you're looking at one big, huge operational complex of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And then I throw in Nazis too.
Oh boy.
Oh boy, yeah. Because there was a young German scholar, in fact, a young homosexual scholar that's kind of also a part of the story, that by the name of Otto Rahn.
Yeah.
That went to the Languedoc in the early 1930s because he was of the opinion that Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, the story of the Grail and the Grail Knights, that this was a coded history of the Cathar nobility and of the Albigensian Crusade.
Yeah.
That was his thesis. So he trots on off to the Languedoc in the early 1930s, and his whole approach to research was to go around, visit all these sites, and interview the local French people about their local traditions and lore concerning that crusade.
Yeah.
And one individual told him something, and I'm not going to tell what it is. I'll wait for the book to come out because it's a whopper.
Oh boy. Oh, Joseph.
One individual came right out and told Otto Rahn that Lucifer's armies, meaning the papal armies,
Mm-hmm.
were looking for something.
Yeah.
That this was the real point of the crusade. And when you find out what it is,
it will blow your mind.
It will blow your mind. If you're familiar with Otto Rahn and his two books that are in English now. Anyway, Otto Rahn writes all this up in a book called Kreuzzug gegen den Graal.
Is it in English?
Yes, the German is Crusade Against the Grail.
Okay.
And it comes to the attention of one Heinrich Himmler, and it was brought to his attention by one Karl Maria Villigut, whom I've written about before in the Philosopher's Stone, that was known kind of nicknamed Himmler's Rasputin. Imagine Heinrich Himmler, vile man that he was, having his own personal Rasputin.
Oh my gosh.
So Otto Rahn is a big part of the story because, of course, during World War II, after the fall of France, the SS did send expeditions into the Languedoc looking for something. Mm-hmm. They sent a whole division in there, and one of the regiments of that division, which, again, I can just see Himmler kind of cackling as he decided on this. One of the regiments of the SS that they sent into the Languedoc to do all this digging was the von Salza regiment. Well, if you know who Konrad von Salza was, he was the founder and first Grand Master of, guess what? The Teutonic Knights.
Oh my God. Oh, Joseph, it just gets thicker and deeper.
It
my God.
It gets thicker and thicker and deeper and deeper. You know, and that's my point here, Georgianne. You cannot write a real good history of the Middle Ages without factoring in all of these things and coming to the conclusion that there's something else going on here that's a huge story that you'll never find in any academic textbook.
Right.
You know, the other part of the story, I can let this out of the bag, is by the time you get to the demise of the Templars under Philip the Fair, and his greasy little lackey, Guillaume de Nogaret,
Yeah.
by the time that Philip decides he's going to shut down the Templars, when the Templars are formally disbanded in France, I think that's 1307, what happens 3 years later?
I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you. Venice founds the Council of Ten.
Oh my God.
Now, why do they do this? Well, I point out that the relationship between the Templars and Venice prior to their demise was so tight that you cannot view the rise of Venetian power in the Mediterranean without the Templars. In other words, the Templars were their eyes and ears.
Yes.
And when you take that intelligence capability away, you have to replace it with something, and that's what they did with the Council of Ten. And interestingly enough, golly, what a coincidence, huh?
Yeah.
The Council of Ten becomes one of the havens for Templar knights that wanted to disappear into the woodwork.
Oh ho.
Oh ho!
Oh ho.
Oh ho!
Oh my God.
Isn't that kind of nifty?
Gee, hold on, Joseph.
Sure.
I gotta let Moshe in now.
Okay.
Just a minute. Okay, we're back.
Okay.
Let me tell everybody, Moshe is a 12-year-old Rottweiler, and when he needs to go out, he needs to go out.
Right away.
Yes. Yes. Okay, Joseph.
Well, anyway, getting back to Venice and the Templars, there has been, through the last few years, a great deal of attention that's been paid to the voyage of Henry Sinclair.
Yes.
With the two Venetian admirals, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, to the New World.
Yes.
Right? Now, this again is where so many people are missing dots, that have to be connected here. Because when you look, and again, I'm spilling some details from the book.
Oh, bless your heart.
But when you look at the Zenos, Antonio and Niccolo, these two Venetian admirals that end up with their galleys way up in the Orkney Islands.
Yeah. Oh, geez.
Well, the story in the Zeno manuscript is that they decided to go exploring in service for their country.
Yeah.
Okay, meaning Venice, all right?
Yeah.
But they are also described in Italian as cavalieri. All right?
Okay.
Knights.
Knights.
They're described as knights.
Oh ho ho.
Oh ho 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 ho. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh ho ho ho. And they're also described as members of the council. Okay?
Uh-huh.
Now, let's stop here and consider what this means. No one that I scoured through, at least doing the research of for this book, pointed this out, okay? So as far as I know, I'm the first one to do so.
Oh, gosh.
Because if you look at the structure of the Venetian Republic, all nobility were, by dint of being nobility, were members of the Grand Council. Okay?
Oh my
that was a
gosh.
given.
Ah.
So in other words, when the manuscript is telling you they were members of the council, it's telling you something special.
Yes.
Because they're already members of the Grand Council just by virtue of being noblemen.
Yeah.
Okay? What council then could they possibly be members of in Venice? Well, at that time, there's only one, and you had to be invited to be members of that council, and guess what it was? It's the Council of Ten.
Oh, my God.
So in other words, once you realize that these two Venetian admirals that end up floating to the New World with Henry Sinclair, once you realize that they're members of the Council of Ten, then you understand that this is being done under the auspices of the Venetian Republic in the agency that is their intelligence service. Okay?
Oh my gosh, Joseph.
And in addition, let's recall what I just said. They're described in the manuscript as cavalieri, in other words, knights.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh my
knights
gosh.
of what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Gee.
And because there is no further description, well, what are they knights of? Given the fact that after the Templar suppression, no one could claim to be member of anything calling itself the Templars. If they were Hospitallers, which of course were traditionally allied with Venice's rival Genoa, they would have been described as Knights of the Order of St. John. Okay?
Oh my goodness.
They're not. They're just described as knights.
Oh.
So in other words, I think there's a very strong circumstantial case here that the Zenos were Templars, and underground at that, and furthermore connected to the Council of Ten.
Oh.
Okay, now, let's roll the clock back to the Fourth Crusade.
Okay.
Shall we?
Yes, indeed.
If you recall, in Financial Vipers of Venice, I argued that it looks like Venice knew of the existence of the New World
Yeah.
because of secret cartographic traditions that they probably uncovered when they sacked Constantinople, and thereby gained access to the imperial archives in Constantinople. All right?
Yeah.
Now, let's remember that at one time, up until about the mid-7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had jurisdiction over Egypt,
Yes.
Alexandria. Okay? So in other words, the probability is that some of those lost treasures of the Library of Alexandria ended up in the archives in Constantinople.
Oh my
All right,
goodness.
along with whatever cartographic tradition may have been preserved there.
Yes.
Now, to sweeten the pot a little bit, guess after the sacking of Constantinople, guess the name of the Podesta, the Venetian governor of the Venetian quarter in Constantinople.
I don't know.
Marin Zeno.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, Joseph. Well,
Hang on, I'm not done.
oh boy. Okay.
Now, because of the Zeno family's access, in other words, the governor of Constantinople after Venice has sacked it is a Zeno.
Yeah.
And it's the Zeno family that, according to the manuscript that's published in the 16th century in England, we'll get back to that.
Oh boy.
Why is this published in England?
Oh
Okay.
boy.
The member of the Zeno family that publishes this manuscript said that he had seen this map that his ancestors had used to sail to the New World with Henry Sinclair, and the map was old with age.
Oh.
Those were his words.
Wow.
So in other words, I'm suspecting that this all came as booty from the sacking of Constantinople. The Zeno family was so well regarded in Venice that they were allowed on their palace in Venice to erect, are you ready for this?
What?
Pyramids.
Oh my God. Gee.
Now that's a strange one.
Yes.
No one knows why would these Venetian admirals, a family associated with the Venetian navy, why would they be honored with the right to build pyramids?
Oh gosh.
Why is the association in Venice of pyramids with the military?
Wow.
Yeah, wow. That's just one of these little details that just really grabbed me and stuck right out there.
Yeah.
So, all of these connections are there. And I think that you can look at the Fourth Crusade and discover, if you're willing to read between the lines and entertain some reasonable speculation, that when those French knights showed up in Venice prior to the beginning of the 12th Crusade, or pardon me, the Fourth Crusade, to negotiate the terms of how they were going to get this massive army from Europe to the Middle East. Well, recall what I said in Financial Vipers of Venice. These French soldiers are described as, guess what? Knights.
Yes.
Okay?
Oh, boy.
And Enrico Dandolo, the Doge, tells them, okay, well, we'll charge you X number of marks for this. We'll build so many galleys to convey so many soldiers with their horses and 20,000 squires. All right, now this, Georgianne, just stop and consider this. This is a huge admission right there as to who these knights are and who they're representing.
Yeah.
Because no other European power at that time would have been able to afford such a huge amount of money.
Right.
Much less field such a huge army other than the Templars.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
I tossed that out there in Financial Vipers of Venice to see if anybody was paying attention.
Oh, gosh. You tossed a lot of stuff out in Financial Vipers of Venice.
Yeah, I did. I did.
Oh.
Because, I wanted to tell the surface story in that book and hint at the the submerged story, and in this book I'm kind of telling the submerged story.
Well, Joseph, when Constantinople was sacked, there were valuable manuscripts.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, beyond any price, they were so valuable.
Yeah.
Where do you think they are today?
In all honesty, oh boy.
Yeah.
You just went right over to that Pandora's box and popped the key in and opened the lid.
Oh, gee. I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
Oh.
That's a huge one, Georgianne. Basically, my suspicion is this. The big question in people who've been following the Templar mystery, okay, is, first of all, that much of their archives in Europe go missing.
Yes.
And let's stop and consider that one just for a moment, if we can.
Okay.
The Templars are, if you look at them and what they are, really, what they are is, first of all, they're the first united European bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Other than the papacy.
Yep.
Secondly, they're involved in what? International banking. Because you put your money in one preceptory here, and you go to the Middle East and take it out in another preceptory there.
Yeah.
Now, in order to coordinate all of that, what do you have to have?
Oh, boy. Yeah, a lot of power.
No, you have to have a system of accounting.
Okay.
And Venice is usually credited for inventing double-entry accounting.
Oh.
But double-entry accounting doesn't pop up publicly in Venice until after the demise of the Templars.
Oh, boy.
So I strongly suspect that all of Venice's accounting secrets, because of their close relationship with the Templars, is coming from there.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay? The third thing that the Templars are, they are the first standing professional army in Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire.
Right.
Okay? So what does that make them? Well, at that time, a knight, with his armor, a knight would have required horses,
Yes.
armaments, and squires. In other words, a knight was a very expensive military technology.
Yes.
Siege engines, fortifications, you name it. So in other words, the Templars are also an international financial, industrial, military intelligence complex.
Oh, my goodness.
They're a conglomerate.
We can't get away from them.
We can't get away from them.
From the industrial complex.
Right. So when the Templars are suppressed, much of their archives go missing, and supposedly their treasure. Now, there are academics out there that say, well, there was never any Templar treasure to be found. It was all loaned out. This is just a big myth. Yada, yada, yada.
Oh,
okay?
boy.
And I think that's so much nonsense.
That's probably what they want them to think.
Well, I think there's a certain degree of that that's possibly true. The Templar fleet that was based in La Rochelle in southern France on the Atlantic coast, that's also missing. Okay, and most people think that this went northward to Scotland with their connection to the Sinclairs. Mm-hmm. And it's true, the de Bouillon family, Godefroy de Bouillon, one of the original 9 Templar Knights, there's that number 9 again, folks.
Yeah.
Was related to the Sinclair family, all right? Mm-hmm. So the reasoning is, well, all this treasure went north and then subsequently to the New World, all right? Yeah. And I think that's possible. I think part of their archives went there. But given the, and I'm getting to your question about Constantinople and their archives, but given the tight relationship between the Templars and Venice, I suspect strongly that some of their archives ended up in the Venetian state archives. This is where no one has thought to look. Oh. As far as I know.
Well,
and, the Venetians were like the Germans. They kept records of everything.
There was a very ancient library. It was probably one of the oldest in the world that I think, I'm not sure, but during the Clinton bombing of Bosnia and all of that, I think that ancient library was destroyed.
Well, I don't know about that. My suspicion about some of this knowledge that the Templars acquired ended up in Venice's hands. I think some of it was directly shipped by the Templars to the New World, but I suspect that what they really shipped to the New World wasn't gold or silver or anything like that, because again, the reason that I'm not persuaded of that is their close working relationship with Venice. And what is Venice? Well, it's Europe's biggest international bullion market.
Yeah.
So if that gold and bullion that the Templars had goes anywhere, I suspect it goes to Venice. All right. Something else, in other words, is what they cart off to North America. And I indicate in part what I think that something else may have been. Now, there's lots of people that think that the Templars sent their stuff to Oak Island.
Yeah.
I'm with Walter Bosley here. I think that if anything went there, it was subsequently moved gradually and over a period of time from the northeastern part of the United States and Canada across the continent and eventually ended up somewhere, possibly, in the American West or Southwest.
That would make sense if it were paper or scrolls, parchment would deteriorate rapidly around the East Coast.
Yeah. If they had things like that, they would copy it and move it, put it on something more permanent.
Yes.
But I do think we're dealing with physical objects here that were moved out of Europe. Partly to keep them away from the papacy. See, this is the other thing we've got to remember. Remember what Otto Rahn learned from the local Languedoc people.
Yes.
That, Lucifer's armies were really looking for something. That's what really was behind all this. And it was moved. They never recovered whatever it was they were looking for. And we know the Templars, the cover story of the Templars was that these 9 knights that go off to Palestine were there to protect pilgrims. Well, you cannot tell me 9 knights is a sufficient number to protect Christian pilgrims from thousands of Muslims.
Yeah, that's right.
And
especially when they're riding 2 on a donkey.
No, this isn't, precisely, this isn't going to work. They were digging for almost 9 years. There's that number again. They were digging for almost 9 years under the Temple Mount.
Yes.
That's what they were doing. Well, so in other words, they clearly had an agenda before they left Europe. They were looking for something. They were looking for something.
Would that something have to do with Jesus?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
But not in the way that most people, again, the theories out there are that this had something to do with the Jewish temple treasure, possibly bloodline information. Like I said before, I think it has more to do with Egypt.
Aha.
Aha.
There we go again.
There we go again.
And all the magical stuff in Egypt.
And all the, yeah, ding, ding, ding.
Oh, boy. Oh, Joseph. Oh, my gosh. Oh.
Now, this is a huge story.
Yeah, it is. It's awesome.
And let's remember, it was the Albigensian Crusade that saw the founding of the Inquisition by, quote, Saint, unquote, Dominic. All right? Domingo Guzman.
Yeah.
All right? That's where you saw the founding of the Inquisition. Well, what's the Inquisition really? What is it?
Trying to get people to talk to...
root out heresy.
Yes.
In other words, put it in modern terms. It's counterintelligence.
Yeah.
It's the Gestapo.
Mm-hmm.
All right? And it's directed by Guzman during the Albigensian Crusade at his headquarters, which is 5 miles away from Montsegur, that big sapphire fortress on top of the rocky crag.
Yeah.
All right? And in other words, he's within sight of this thing.
Oh.
So they're looking for something.
Mm-hmm.
And who's involved in the demise of the Templars? Well, the Inquisition.
Oh, brother.
You see?
Yeah.
And that whole thing, Georgianne, and I don't mean to keep taking up your time and keeping you awake here.
Go.
Go.
Yeah.
If you look at Philippe le Bel,
Mm-hmm.
the King of France that begins the process of their demise,
Yeah.
he writes a letter to the crowned heads of Europe outlining the charges against the Templars, okay?
Yes.
And we know what the charges are. Well, they're worshiping heads.
He would be a John Kerry.
Yeah, he's even better. He's more like, well, let me set this up and then I'll mention the connection.
Okay.
He draws up this list of charges and sends them in a letter to the other crowned heads of Europe. We got to take care of this problem. We need to eliminate the Templars, and I can only do it here in France, so I'm relying on you to take care of all these hideous heretics in your own lands, okay?
Okay.
Well, the list of charges, if you stop and think about it, is so ridiculous. They're worshiping severed heads. They're worshiping heads with two faces. They're grinding up the bones of dead members of the order and eating them. They're, I'm not kidding. This is the list of charges.
That sounds like John Kerry, all right.
They're sacrificing babies and sprinkling the cremated remains in the chalice of the Mass. And,
God.
I'm not kidding. These are the charges.
Yeah.
And your reaction says it all. The charges are so ridiculous that the other crowned heads of Europe don't believe them.
Good.
But now stop. Wait. Whoa. Stop.
Okay.
Think about this. If your objective is to ensure the demise of an international order, why would you draw up charges that are so ridiculous that they're counter to your purpose?
I don't know.
Well, that's the problem. This may be an indicator that there's something to the charges.
Oh, my gosh.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The other problem here is that we're told in the academic histories that Philip the Fair wanted to seize Templar wealth because he was in a financial crunch.
Yeah.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
But when the final decree at the Council of Vienne in France disbands the order, all of their wealth is turned over to their rivals, the Hospitallers. In other words, Philip the Fair doesn't get a dime for his efforts. So in other words, we have to look at the possibility that there was another agenda This is why I say you have to look at the demise of the Templars, the Albigensian Crusade, and their non-participation therein, and the Fourth Crusade as one big, huge operational complex. And at some point, the papacy gets wind that something is amiss. Okay? I think it's the papacy, in other words, driving the demise, not Philip the Fair.
Oh, my gosh.
I think it's the exact opposite of what the textbooks tell you.
Well, the papacy was probably afraid of whatever the Templars had that could bring down the papacy.
If that's true.
Yeah.
I don't think that's... No. I don't think that it was something the Templars were blackmailing or that could bring down the papacy.
Okay.
I think what's really going on here is you have a struggle for control over certain objects, number one, and you have a struggle for control of certain information. And both the papacy and the Templars know what it is.
Yeah.
They're just doing different things with it.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, oh, boy. Oh, boy.
Well, Joseph...
Because...
Okay, go ahead.
Because...
Because...
When Columbus sails,
Uh-huh.
the Nina Maria Pinta...
Yeah.
What's on their sails?
The big cross.
The big red cross.
Yes.
Right. Now, at the Council of Vienne in France, I pardon my French pronunciation, folks, I don't speak French. But at that council, the council decreed that no one could display the Templar symbols.
Oh, my God.
It was an excommunicable offense.
Oh.
And there Columbus goes boldly displaying it, okay?
Yeah.
Moreover, on the grave of Pope Innocent VIII, Giovanni Cibo was his name, all right? Let's look at Giovanni Cibo. There was a wonderful Italian researcher by the name of Ruggero Marino that published a book called Columbus the Last Templar. Wonderful book. If you haven't read it, read it. And I review the book in my new book. Giovanni Cibo was the nephew of a Muslim, son of a Christian, and had Jewish roots as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so in a pope, let's stop and consider here. In a pope, we now have family connections to each of the three religions, okay?
Yeah.
Cibo was from Genoa, just like Christopher Columbus. He was Genoese. But he had spent time in the Eastern Mediterranean as, guess what?
I don't know.
A knight.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, my gosh.
And when he was elected pope, his opposition was also, guess what? A knight.
Oh, my God.
So in other words, the conclave electing Cibo is a conclave that is running candidates from the crusading orders.
Oh, my God. Oh, Joseph.
Are we getting the picture that something big is going on here?
Oh, my gosh, yes.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
And it's never stopped.
And it's never stopped.
Wow.
Now, one more tidbit here for you. A little cherry on top of the sundae. Christopher Columbus's son, Ferdinand,
Yes.
wrote that his father was of obscure origins,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
But that he was descended from the royal house of David.
Yeah. Gee.
And on Pope Innocent's tomb, Innocent VIII's tomb, Giovanni Cibo, on his tomb, what do you find? You find Christopher Columbus's signature.
Oh, my gosh.
What's it doing there?
Yeah, what? Oh, my gosh, Joseph. You've uncovered some... Oh, my gosh. I mean, It's beyond remarkable. I mean,
It's
my
huge,
gosh.
Ferdinand.
Yes,
It's
it
huge.
is huge, and they have never stopped. I
No.
think their plan is still afoot.
Well, yeah, I do too. And the reason why is behind all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you're going to be, I think once people see some of the family connections here, particularly with the politics that's going on
Yeah.
in the early Enlightenment period
Mm-hmm.
in Central Europe, I think when people see the family connections there,
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
going to, well, I'll just come out and say what they are. I'm not going to say how they are, but you have a family connected to James the First, James Stewart,
Yeah.
and the same family is connected to, ultimately, will be connected to the House of Orange.
Oh, boy.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
And it's connected to the Counts of Champagne in France,
Mm-hmm.
and directly to the de Bouillon family.
Oh, my God.
And who's the first Grand Master of the Templars? Well, Godefroy de Bouillon.
Yep. Oh,
Yep.
my gosh, Joseph.
Ding, ding, ding.
You're not kidding. Ding, ding, ding.
Ding,
is
ding,
right.
ding. Uh-huh.
Oh. Wow.
And what's the response to all this? Why, Bernini puts up a big obelisk, right, in smack dab in the center of the Vatican.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
You know, there's a Vatican part of this story that I don't get into in this book, but there's a Hermetic circle at the Vatican.
Oh.
So in other words, what's going on here is you're looking at a real big, huge struggle for control over Hermeticism. That's what you're looking at.
Oh, my God. Oh. This is awesome, Joseph.
It's huge. Yeah, I know it's huge.
Oh, my God.
It's huge.
Mm.
And
it's
when
bigger
you say,
than UFOs or off-planet people or the moon.
well, let's look at that. What are the Templars? If they've got secret knowledge, secret cartographic tradition, and they're making secret voyages to the New World, what do you got?
Oh, God.
You've got a breakaway civilization, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Ding, ding, ding.
Oh, my God.
And if what they're looking for has anything to do with Egypt, as I think it does, then you're looking at a millennia-old agenda here.
Oh. Well, this would have been started by whomever the gods were to begin with.
In a certain sense, yes.
Oh, my God, Joseph.
In a certain sense, yes.
Oh.
I revisit our good old friend, the topological metaphor, and again,
Yeah.
I have to warn people, I simply cut and paste all of what I've said about that metaphor from other books into this one, because people picking up this book for the first time will need to know what it is.
Yes.
People that are familiar with it are now going to be thrown the genealogical interpretation of it.
Oh, my God.
Because, yeah, there's a genealogical thing going on here.
Oh.
And it's old.
Very old.
Oh, very old.
Oh,
yes.
my gosh.
In fact, I've been hinting about this in some of my members' vid chats on my website.
Uh-huh.
And one gentleman sent me an email because I had said, well, if you're going to track all this during the period when there are no written records in Europe, there's only one way to do that, and that's via heraldry.
Yes.
So he sends me a picture of an old Babylonian cylinder seal where you see Ninurta seated on his throne.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you see behind him? You see a double-headed bird.
Oh, my gosh. Like in Egypt.
Like in the family arms of the House of Habsburg.
Yes, that
like
too.
in the family arms of the House of Tizen.
Oh, my gosh.
Like is prominently displayed in many Masonic emblems.
Oh.
Like in the family arms of the House of Romanov.
Good Lord.
Uh-huh.
I'll bet this stuff sets your hair on fire. Oh my gosh.
Well, I got to be honest, Georgianne, I didn't put half the stuff in this book that I wanted to.
Why not?
Because the other half of the stuff that's going to require some care in laying out there.
Okay.
My focus was on the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and early Enlightenment, and what I think is going on here. You've got a body of doctrine that's clearly in play.
Yeah.
It transforms European culture. People don't realize when they're listening to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, they're listening to Hermetic music.
Yeah.
Because the music theory texts at that time, which are outlining the craft of counterpoint, they're written in alchemical terms.
Oh my gosh.
In other words, the same terms that you find in alchemical literature are applied to counterpoint. Well, the question is why?
Yeah, why?
And the answer is because that kind of music is information processing.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
It's that transmutative, information creating physical medium again. That's being mirrored.
Joseph, with so much crappy so-called music on the market today, it rewires the brain to stupidity.
Yes,
whereas if they would listen to Johann Bach, it would rewire to some brilliance.
I listened to that kind of music growing up. That was, I was a nerd, Georgianne. I listened to classical music all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that it's because of that that I'm able to see connections so easily.
Yeah.
Because if you really are listening to Sebastian Bach, or for that matter his son, with real intelligent concentration and can actually hear what they're doing with the information, it does wire the brain, as you say.
Yes.
It wires the brain in a very different way.
And even pregnant women. There's these belts that they can wear and play music that the baby can hear while it's in the womb. And I think that's an excellent idea for classical music. Well,
all of those composers from that era, from the High Baroque period on up to the early Beethoven, and then some of the Romantic composers as well do this. I mean, there was a craft of teaching music in a certain way.
Yes.
That it relied on figured bass. In other words, it was mathematical in nature.
Yes.
That's the way I learned music. That's the way that my organ teacher in high school taught me.
Wow. And
it's a very different. Once you get deeply into it, it's different than the way music is taught now.
Oh yeah. Today it's just cut, copy, paste.
Well, it's not that. It's more involved. But I try and do a little analysis of a couple of sections of a couple of pieces by J.S. and C.P.E. Bach, so that people can perhaps at least get the basic idea of what's really going on.
Yeah.
That it's nothing but endless permutations of the same information, over and over and over, and that process creates the music.
Yeah. Wow.
Even in passages where you think there's absolutely nothing, that what you're listening to has absolutely nothing to do with what you first heard when the piece began. But if you stop and pick it apart,
oh boy,
it really, it's there.
Wow.
So, yeah, I agree with you. We live in a stunted musical culture because what we have now...
We live in a stunted mental culture.
Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
Our music is melody and harmony with an endless bang, bang, bang of, jungle rhythm behind it.
You bet.
You listen to the box, and you're listening to several independent lines of music making harmonic sense.
Yeah.
That's a different. There's a reason that jazz and the Baroque are so closely connected. That's why.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have the same thing going on in jazz. The difference between jazz and the Baroque composers is jazz is all improvisation. Well, the Baroque composers knew that. They called it fantasia.
Yeah.
They could sit down and improvise, but most of their music is coming out of their head right on the score paper. In other words, it's jazz that's being deliberately crafted
Oh my
and
gosh.
written down note for note. That takes some thinking.
Yeah, it does. Oh, wow. Oh, Joseph, this has been quite an adventure. Oh.
Yeah, it's. I hope the book. I hope the book won't be a disappointment to people, because it is. I warn them right up front. It's a messy book.
Oh, wow. Give the name of the book again.
It's called Thrice Great Hermetica and the Janus Age.
Wow. Oh. Everybody, you've got to get it. You've just got to get this book. Wow.
Should be out in a couple of weeks,
Oh.
from what I've been told.
Okay.
And I already have it up on my website web store.
Okay. Go to Joseph P. Farrell's website, not Cosmic Wars.
He's a Death Star.
GizaDeathStar.com. We've done so many Cosmic Wars,
Yeah.
and people love them, as I do. And work out his PayPal button and put your order in. Get a copy of this book. I think it's better if they order it off of your page.
Yeah, I get a few extra pennies
Yeah.
from orders off my page. It goes through Amazon, but
Yeah.
Amazon pays me a little advertising fee. So.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, it helps a little bit.
Well, Joseph, my God.
Thanks for having me back.
Oh, anytime. Oh, my gosh. Yikes.
Yeah, this is, yeah.
Wow.
Huge story.
Yes, it is. And I can see why you've taken so many books to
set it up.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you just, boom, here it is, people aren't ready for it.
They're not ready for it, and the dots have to be, this is like a big, huge chess game. Every book in this series of books has to be thought out ahead of time and sequenced, and it's very hard to do. And this one is setting up a lot of others that I hope I'll be able to get to.
Well, we hope and pray that you will, because you are amazing, Joseph. Just amazing. And thank you.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Oh, anytime. So you've been listening to Joseph P. Farrell.
Help Georgianne out, folks,
Oh,
please help Georgianne.
Thank you, Joseph.
You're welcome.
And go to GizaDeathStar.com and order his book, his new one that's coming out, and also please make a contribution. So there you go, everybody. Good night.
Good night.